Hello, this is the Net Hero podcast. I'm Sumit Bose, and this podcast is all about business and doing better for the planet. It's not an eco podcast, we're not green warriors. We believe that business is good and business will make the difference, but it's about holding businesses to account. So if you're interested in what we're doing to try and make things better, to stop our polluting of the planet, to stop our global warming, to stop us driving around in cars that are polluting the air that we breathe, this is the podcast for you. It's all about business, it's about invention, it's about entrepreneurs, scientists, and frankly, there's a few wild cards as well. Do hope you enjoy listening to this episode, and make sure you subscribe and follow us on your social media platforms, and please check out our two news websites, energylivenews.com and Future Net Zero. On with the show. Standards. Oh boy, standards. I remember my teacher saying I had pretty shit standards a long time ago. Standards are what we measure everything by. So whether you've got, your weight, good God, when you get on the scales, how fast you're driving on the roads, the gauge of your railway lines, all of these things. We've got standards for everything in life. And you've hopefully read the news lately that we're going to have new standards for carbon accounting. There are countless standards out there, and they're all part of kind of how we measure whether we're progressing on net zero. But it's all very well having standards, but are they being shifted? There's no doubt that you'll have seen there is a big debate on whether we still go down the net zero path. The Tories have now said they'll repeal the Climate Change Act. You had old Trumpy come over and say, drill, baby, drill. We've even had the boss of Octopus Energy saying we should look at getting oil and gas. So what's the state of business confidence in net zero? Well, I'm delighted to say a lady who knows everything about standards joins me for this episode. Susan Taylor-Martin, great name, I love it, from BSI. Are you the boss? Are you the chief ruler maker?
I am the chief executive, correct.
Have you got a ruler? That's what I have to ask you.
Yeah, no rulers, but plenty of standards. And you're right, plenty of standards.
You do look like someone with good standards, Susan.
Good standards. We keep very high standards, but important standards, exactly as you were saying actually at the outset.
Yeah.
We're the national standards body for the UK, and so we look after probably somewhere between 35 and 45,000 standards. And they're the things that go all the way from very technical standards, so specifications, all the way through to things like what we call management system standards. So, for example, quality. And the really, really important thing is the standards that we're responsible for underpin probably about 80% of global trade.
Wow.
So there's nothing that we could do without them, as it were. So super important. And I should actually, just as a clarification, we are the UK's national standards body. We're also the UK representative on something called ISO, which is the International Standardization Organization. And actually, the bulk of British standards are indeed international standards. So that's what makes them powerful, actually, is the international piece.
We talked just before we recorded about kind of lovely old Gunnersbury, where it was, but just giving, because it's a very important thing before we talk about what we're going to discuss. What's the history of this? Because I sort of facetiously said about railway lines, but I think some of it started with that, didn't it? So how have we ended up with this body, the BSI, in the first place?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because it was kind of the turn of the 20th century when people realized that the lack of standardization was very ineffective and very costly, and nothing fitted. And in fact, one of the first things that was standardized was exactly that. It was kind of was around kind of trams and railways. So making sure that the components kind of fitted in, could be interoperable. So that's exactly where it started. And so that kind of industrial scaling, that kind of the industrial world, as it were, post-industrial revolution, obviously, but kind of the I don't know whether it's the second or the third industrial age, whichever that was, kind of turn of the century. And we were founded back in 1901.
Oh, okay. So that's a bit more modern than I thought. I thought it was like an 18 or 1700s thing. So, okay.
So it was really kind of post First World War, where I think really people understood, my goodness, we need to be much more kind of coordinated. And as with the globalization and the kind of, well, with the industrialization and the globalization of effectively the modern supply chain, standards became essential because how could you make sure that a component was indeed what you thought it was going to be, number one?
Yeah.
But increasingly, how can you trust that the way in which that component is manufactured, adheres to the right quality management standards or the right environmental standards, actually? And BSI was the first, we sort of, as with a number of things from a British perspective, we kind of punch above our weight in the standards world. We've always been one of the kind of the early movers on things. We were a very early mover on the first environmental management standard. If you're in the world of standards, you know these things by numbers. So it's called 14,001.
I've heard of it. Yeah.
Which is around environmental management, and that came originally from the UK actually, and it was put into the international system. So always kind of actually the focus on environment and sustainability there from kind of early on.
So the aim was it? I assume was it set up like Royal Charter? Is it kind of like a government body?
You're right. You're right. We're a Royal Charter, and
Right.
we are what we call a purpose with profit organization. So we have to make money to fund what we do. And we do that by selling standards, but also by doing
What's one of the
some
parts of the world?
training, exactly, training, certification and assurance. Actually, the standards we can only sell in the UK. So we're part of this ISO community. And so every national standards body can sell standards within their particular country, their geographic region, as it were. But what we can do is we can assure against those standards and certify to those standards and train to those standards. And that for us is actually a very global business. So we've got about 6,000 people around the world. We operate in kind of 190 countries, as many countries as there are as kind of where we're operating.
And so, in terms of a business, so the people who are listening, how would they come across you? Because I suppose most people probably wouldn't know. It's just kind of set up. But you say you sell a standard. What would it be? Someone says, "Oh, I don't know, I'm going to invent a new phone or something like that." Why would they need a standard from you?
There are kind of a whole range of reasons that people want standards. It can be, and for a whole variety of reasons. So, for example, kind of a current clutch of standards that we're working on that we're very focused on is around AI, where
Okay,
we
right.
think it's important that there is kind of safe and ethical AI use out there. So we've got one of these kind of management system standards, which is all around governance around AI. So not looking into the kind of the technology, as it were, but looking into making sure that you are using your data in the right way, making sure that it's kind of, so it kind of one up from a very important information management standard called 27,001. So that's an example of the sort of standard where we've got new things that are coming to market, exactly as you say, and where we think there is a case for making sure that however that technology is used, it's being used safely and ethically. There are a whole range of standards that we're involved in from a sustainability perspective.
Yeah.
All the way from kind of circularity, how can we make sure that kind of thing, what's the right approach to implementing circularity economic principles, all the way through to, for example, we've done some work with DEFRA around nature-based markets. So if we want to have these nature-based markets, we'll need standards to kind of underpin that, to understand what's being traded. We've worked with the Department of Transport, for example, in the UK around zero emissions HGV vehicles. We're working on carbon capture with DESNZ. So a whole range of areas. You're exactly right, kind of where there's innovation.
Yes.
And where we think a standard can accelerate kind of progress, that's our kind of sweet spot. Just to go back to something that you mentioned, you're right, we operate under an MOU with the UK government. So they're a very important stakeholder for us, and therefore, what they're trying to achieve, we want to be able to make sure that they've got the standards that they can use, because they don't always have to rely on regulation. Sometimes a standard can be super, super effective, because the secret sauce, in a way, of a standard is there are two things that I'd really pull out. The first is we actually don't develop the standards as BSI. What we do is we bring together people to agree what consensus, what good looks like.
That's what I was going to ask you. Do you have a team of boffins sitting in the back?
So we've got about 13,000 committee members from across the UK that will contribute to all manner of standards. And They can be academics, they can be industry representatives, they can be consumer representatives, really, really important. They can be government. So a whole range of people come together to agree what good looks like. So that consensus or all voices heard principle is really, really important. Second thing that's really important is these standards can also be verified. So we're part of something called the National Quality Infrastructure, which includes an organisation called UCAS in the UK and NPL, National Physical Laboratory. And that just makes sure that, to your point about rulers earlier, we've got a way of measuring and we've got a way of checking that the standard is indeed being implemented. And that is super, super powerful because it really allows you to kind of track progress.
So in terms of let's take the example you just mentioned there, a new technology, carbon capture, right? So you'd get a bunch of people who are, I don't know, scientists who are very good on carbon, right? Get a bunch of those physicists and chemists. Then you might get some farmers, right? Then you might get some gas users, end users or factories. Then you might get people who were just kind of general consumers, end users. I have to say this, but if you've got all these different voices, it's hard enough to herd cats. How do you come up with this is the standard by which all carbon capture plants must operate? Because it must take ages.
So that is exactly the process, though. That's exactly right. And what we are skilled in, so is the kind of the running of a process that will end up with that consensus. And you're right, digital technology has actually made that a lot easier. We might talk later on about, I think one of the most important standards we've been working on is the ISO Net Zero standard. So this will be the first verifiable ISO Net Zero standard, hopefully coming out in 2026. We had over 1,200 people work on the guidelines that were the kind of the basis for the standard from over 100 countries. So what's fascinating is, and this kind of, people really care about these topics and really want to contribute. And we've got a way that is used across the world, across ISO, of kind of making sure that we get that kind of input, because just as we here in the UK are contributing to that standard through our committees, that is happening everywhere in the world. So every single one of the 137, I think it is, national standards bodies are contributing to that work. So when it comes out, what's really, really powerful is we've got consensus to kind of move ahead. And it's one of the few highly functional operating international systems out there, really. So it's a powerful beast.
I think you should take over running the country, shouldn't you? If you can get 1,200 people to agree on something, we can't even get a couple of people in. It's mad politics. So the process will be the technology gets invented. You then get a whole bunch of people together. Now, couple of quick questions, sort of quick fire round. Is it mandatory that whenever someone invents something, they have to get a BSI or an ISO standard?
No, and there are other standards, I should say, out there. So, for example, around digital technologies, there are some different standards, not just kind of the ISO standards, but it isn't mandatory, no.
So this is a voluntary thing then, is it really?
These are voluntary standards. Wow. It's a really, really important point. Now, sometimes the government can choose to mandate these standards, and that's kind of called a kind of a designate or a harmonized standard. So occasionally they are kind of part of law.
Illegal, yeah.
But they don't have to be.
Right. So that's the first thing. Secondly, in terms of, you talked about getting everyone together. Who gets these experts? Do you have a team that know, okay, this is this tech, so we're going to get that one, that one, that one, and that one? Because again, there's 1,000 voices with 1,000 different opinions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is part of the skill that we have in terms of being able to, we've got a vast network of people that typically really care and will volunteer their time because they care about the topic, whatever the subject is. And it can be a super, super technical pressure valve that's used in a kind of a refrigeration system. I mean, we've got committees on those sorts of topics. So it's really kind of a vast array of things that we work on. So that kind of technical expertise is really important. And yes, we do typically know who will be there. Now, we are always interested in bringing more people into that network. So if there is anybody that is interested, that's listening to this podcast and wants to get engaged, then we'd be thrilled to have them, because you can never have enough experts actually out there.
So the experts get together, and by miracle, thanks to your team, they
Yep.
come up with an opinion. So then, do they have to write? Is a standard an actual written document that says this is what you must do?
It is a written document today.
Right.
It is a written document today. Now, we may not get to this in this conversation, but ultimately we are working on something much more digital.
I was
So
going to
the
say,
idea of what we're calling smart standards,
right.
because you can imagine a world where actually a lot of those standards, particularly where they're involved in manufacturing processes, you can imagine why isn't that being kind of taken straight into a kind of an engineering production line, as it were. So I think that world is coming. But today, there's still documents with clauses and all the rest of it, but that will change.
So the next stage is I've made my phone powered by cow poo. That's amazing. It's great. It's recyclable. You've agreed a standard for that. What do I then do? I sign up to that standard, or anyone else who wants to make this kind of phone has to sign up to that standard? How does it work? Because I'm trying to get is what's the enforcement?
So you're right, these are kind of voluntary standards
Yeah.
typically, and so organizations will choose or not to kind of to use a particular
Ah,
standard. Now, if they care, if they've got a global supply chain,
yeah.
or if they want to export their product globally, they'd be super wise to have kind of the relevant standards in their space because those are often required. So say you're in the supply chain of a large engineering company, as a small manufacturer, actually being able to produce something to a given standard
Gotcha.
means that you can then supply that larger organization. Equally, if you want to go into a different market, this is a way that you can prove your trustworthiness, the quality of your
Okay.
product.
So we're getting to the crux of it. This is basically, even though it's not mandatory, it can help you get business. It gives you credibility. They're the main
Absolutely.
things, yeah?
Absolutely. It allows you to kind of enter markets,
Yeah.
and it means that you're trusted because you've effectively kind of got this kind of mark of trust, as in terms of kind of using a standard, and being certified to that standard is particularly kind of powerful. And that's why they've clearly taken off, right? You know,
Yeah.
80% of global trading goods rely on people using these standards.
So thank you very much. That's a good background. I think that really explains what you guys are up to. In terms of the energy sector, and I said in the beginning, all the changes have happened. So let's just recap. Let's go back 5 years. Basically, COVID has opened everyone's eyes, and suddenly, oh my God, there are birds. There are clean rivers when we're not around. And everyone signs up to net zero. Every bugger out there is committing, we're going to go green by this target, we're going to do all of that, blah, blah, blah. Then two big factors happened. One is the Ukraine invasion by Russia, which just skeltered everything. And then I think, the economic downturn that's globally has affected everyone. And so you've then had this beginning of actually, what is this going to cost? And then the third factor has been political, where people have now started to see, fair play to them, but pretty much China runs renewables. And people are starting to go, well, hang on a second. They're not following enough rules in terms of cutting their emissions, and yet we're doing it. So all of this has led to where we are now, where there is a definite pullback. There isn't a definite kind of rethinking. Even Boris Johnson, Mr. Net Zero, just put out this, the other week, he put out the voice that said, maybe I went too far, too fast. Now, I don't think it's over. I don't think net zero is dead, but it's definitely formed a rethink. Now, you've got a report, you call it a barometer, right?
Mm.
So, what have you found? First of all, who did you ask,
Yeah.
and what did you find?
Yeah, so we run something called the Net Zero Barometer. We've done it since 2021, really to kind of explore attitudes and experiences of UK businesses to kind
Yeah,
of to net zero to the topic. And it skews kind of to the SME because about 60% of our respondents, we had about 1,000 respondents, 60% of those were either micro or SME businesses, so anywhere between 9 and 249
yeah,
employees. And then 40% were larger organizations, so 250 employees plus.
yeah.
And it was interesting because I think we did find that kind of confidence amongst UK businesses that the country can meet our kind of net zero targets has undoubtedly kind of waned. And while 64% of companies were saying they still want to be committed to those UK, and we've committed obviously to a kind of a legally binding 2050 net zero target. So 64% said this year, yep, we still think we can get there. That's actually dropped from 83% last year. So a really significant kind of drop, which I think is pretty interesting. And I think the proportion that said they were really committed to that net zero target had also dropped somewhat from about, I think it was 31% last year to about 25% this year. And the people that thought we were very likely to kind of reach net zero by 2050 has fallen from 76% in 2024 to just 55% this last year. So you can absolutely see that sentiment kind of coming through that data. Now, the survey itself does skew to this sort of SME population, which I think is interesting. And I do think there's something very telling that actually when you separated out our SME population from our larger organizations, there was a real difference, because large organizations were significantly more optimistic,
of course,
about reaching kind of net zero. That was almost 90%, just to give you an idea, versus kind of SMEs and micro businesses, much, much lower. And actually, that's where we saw the steepest decline. So it is in small and medium-sized firms typically that are finding that much more challenging.
And that is 96% of all business in this country. So this is quite significant. So looking at it all, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you feel that realities have really hit home? Yeah, I think what was your figure? That 70, what was it? What 74 to it fell from 74, was it?
The proportion said we were likely to reach net zero. You're right, had fallen from 76 to 55%.
That's huge. That's huge.
It's a big shift. I mean, I think ours is just one snapshot.
No,
I
get
think
that.
there are other pieces of data that would say something kind of slightly different. And I look at the kind of the net zero global stock take, for example, which still shows that people are kind of committing to net zero and setting targets, which is good. And still, even with kind of the political change of heart in the US, for example, we're still seeing that that's very important kind of across the globe. In terms of GDP that's covered by net zero targets, it's still very, very high, kind of, over 80%. When you take in all of the US state related kind of commitments to net zero. So I think there's still a huge amount of kind of commitment there, but you're right. I think this is quite a challenging time. One of the things that we took away that was interesting is a large number, so 83% said, we really need guidance. We need to know what to do. And obviously that's important for us.
They need some standards, Susan.
Because I think standards can absolutely help, because that's one of the things that standards aren't some kind of esoteric thing. They are super, super practical. They're like condensed, codified kind of best practice. And particularly, for example, with the net zero standard coming out, I think that is going to be very, very helpful, because it is combining a lot of the frameworks and schema that are already out there, which have been quite confusing, I think, particularly for smaller organizations to deal with, into something that I think is much simpler, because I do think we need to make it simpler for people. They need to understand what practical steps that they can take moving forward. So that 83%, I think, gave us quite a lot of hope that actually with the right kind of guidance, organizations would feel more comfortable.
Does it really fall on you, or is this really falling on government?
I think
or is it falling on business? You could say it doesn't matter what's going on politically, and some businesses, I'm sure, like the ones in your survey, we know them. We don't really care what's going on. We want to do this, and we're going to do this. But they are big, and they can afford to do that. Myself, my companies are, we've done that as much as we can. But if suddenly new standards came in, we're going, well, hang on a second, can we afford that? So in that sense, who would you say? You say, great, your standards, and I do believe that would play a part. But at the end of the day, there's got to be a will from politics, which seems to be shifting, and a will economically or from business to say it makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think from a UK perspective, I think the policy and the direction of travel is pretty clear, actually.
Yeah.
So I think we've got a huge advantage here. And I do think that's something that is very, very important, because one of the things that kind of slows down taking action is uncertainty. And so the extent to which we've got kind of political certainty, without question, kind of helps. No question. I think the other things there are areas where I think standards can absolutely help. I think there is confusion around what good looks like. So many different
Yeah.
ways of looking at it, so many
Yeah.
different things that you could measure. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It is very, very confusing. So I think that that's an area where we can certainly help. And I think these international standards can, really kind of at the scale at which they operate, I think can be very helpful. And I think the other area is who can we trust to verify these claims? Because I think, again, we've seen examples of kind of greenwashing, and that
Yeah.
really is unfortunate when that happens. We've got to make sure that we've got something that's verifiable. And again, I think that's one of the powers of kind of not just the standard, but the fact that we've got certification and accreditation that goes together with that standard that means that you can verify. So that certainty, I think, and direction of travel, I think absolutely has to come from the government. And I think in the UK, I think we've got real clarity there, which is great. And I think we can help with some of the other pieces together with, the members of this national quality infrastructure from a UK perspective.
The survey was UK, correct?
It was just UK.
Right, but I mean, you have sister organisations, you said at the beginning. Do you know if any of them done this in other parts of the world and what the feeling is?
We haven't. That's a really good thing to kind of to see whether
Yeah.
other organizations are doing that. One of the things, though, that is very interesting, a few years ago, BSI sponsored something at ISO called the London Declaration. And this was about the fact that we realized we've got lots of standards out there that don't have a kind of an environmental component, aren't taking climate science into context when delivering that standard. The London Declaration was basically saying we are going to ensure that every single standard is taking sustainability into account. And that is now happening on a global basis, which is fantastic. So this is kind of building this whole topic into the scaffolding on which we trade. And there we're seeing incredible take up of that. And interestingly, on standards where there's not a kind of an obvious sustainability angle, so for example, around quality, organizations now have got to consider that as part of their certification process. And we've got wonderful data that's really kind of, again, just from the UK at the moment, but really kind of opening up the fact that organizations are thinking about this differently and are thinking about how they can take action. So it's not the kind of regulatory reporting push. It's thinking actually to be a good organization, what does that look like and how do I do that? We're going to expand that research that we've done for the UK kind of globally next year. And I think it'll be really interesting because that was it's called the London Declaration, but it applied globally. And we know that standards bodies across the world are really kind of implementing that. So I think that, that will also kind of change things because I think to your point, organizations are still pushing ahead.
Yeah.
They are still pushing ahead. And, another very interesting that came out of our net zero barometer was the fact that consumers are the main driver of action in this space. So consumer demand was the leading driver of net zero action. So I think that was kind of 40% of respondents said consumers were really driving the way. So companies can't just sit back because their consumers are going to demand something different. And again, we know that skews younger. And so that is only just going to grow. So, there isn't really an opportunity to kind of sit back. Actually, people have got to kind of forge forward.
You said you've been doing this, is it 4 years now? 21, correct? The first barometer.
Yes.
This has been the biggest fall, correct? I'm assuming.
Yes.
Putting on your sort of analysis hat, which I'd expect you to be very good at with the standards. What's your sort of litmus test of sentiment then? What do you think personally?
Yeah, I mean, we take this as I said before, it's a snapshot from the UK, and we're using it to try to think how we can help. So that's kind of our sort of modus.
Of course.
Kind of, that's kind of the mindset through which we're approaching it. And I do think we've seen this kind of interesting request for support, which is interesting. And I think that is now really being driven by people wanting to take action. It's not so much a kind of a reporting requirement or the regulation is kind of saying, actually, it's more, actually, we need to take some practical action. And we have seen kind of pick up in various things that we're doing across the organization, which also kind of which would support that hypothesis. So, for example, we've got something called the Net Zero Pathway, where we help organizations, take kind of those logical, auditable steps towards kind of net zero. We're seeing real demand for that. We've got an interesting kind of mini standard, if you will, called a Flex, which is all about helping SMEs kind of take action. And again, we're seeing great kind of take up of that. So the good thing is, although people are feeling perhaps kind of less confident, particularly at the smaller end in terms of where we're going, actually, I think there is a real shift towards kind of people taking action. And I think that I see that and be interested in your views, but I see that in the broader context too, because there is this shift from kind of virtue signaling to value and a real focus on the science is still saying the same thing.
Yeah, without
That
doubt.
is not changing. So we are going to have to take action. And I think there is data out there where people are really concerned, particularly around their supply chains. I mean, an interesting data point recently that said by the end of next year, I think the estimation is the climate-related impact or negative impact on the supply chain is going to cost something like $120 billion globally. By the end of the century, or actually by mid-century, I don't think it was even by the end of the century, I think by mid-century, it was saying that cost is going to rise to $25 trillion. So it's inescapable. And so if organizations aren't thinking about whether it's energy security, as you mentioned before, whether it's around kind of supply chain, thinking about the kind of potential risk of not taking action, that's a very, very short-term view. And I think organizations are trying to think much more long-term than that.
I think that's fair. I actually think that the reality is that we did go too fast without thinking. And I think the reality is people are now going, well, we want to do this, but we can't afford to do this. So you're going to have to change and the targets will move. My personal view is I doubt we're going to hit the 2050 target, but that doesn't mean we can't reduce. And I certainly see that in all the podcasts I do, in all the news on Energy Live News, people are still committed to it because you said it, you nailed it at the beginning there, just in that little section. It's consumers.
Yeah.
If consumers want, a phone that lasts 10 years rather than 2 years and is recyclable, they'll get it. If people want to drive EVs, that will happen. If people want to use heat pumps, that'll happen. It's the consumer that will drive it. But if companies think that that kind of drive is gone, I don't think that's the case. I think that people are very, very savvy about what's this, I can't do this without. And another point is the fairness, because you can't have China and other places keep emitting and you'll keep being told, it's particularly in the UK, to keep making sacrifices.
I think that's right. I think the other thing is I've noticed a kind of a change in tone, and I don't know whether you've seen the same, which is I think at some point that we used understandably but very kind of catastrophic language about what was happening. And I think that's almost scared people off to kind of think, actually, this is so, what on earth can I do? And you're right, from a UK perspective.
Okay, I'm going to do nothing.
From a UK perspective, we know that we're just responsible for, 1% of kind of emissions. So it's actually that I think has been kind of unhelpful. And I do think we're starting to kind of change to much more of a kind of every little helps, right? And we can all help. And actually, through our supply chain, actually, the UK is very, very impactful. So there are absolutely things that we can do. And we've made a ton of progress, and we never talk about that, which is so interesting, actually, in terms of, I think we've cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% since 1990.
Yeah, decarbonise.
I mean, that's nothing to be...
50% of the grid is
not to be
is green right now. Yeah, exactly. And 15 years ago it was 5%. So it's incredible.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think 50% of our electricity now comes from renewables in the UK. So there is progress being made. I don't think we're doing enough about telling that positive story, because I think it's a really positive story. And I think and this is where I think BSI can play a role, is there are a number of areas where we just need to kind of move forward and give people really practical tools where they can make a difference. So I think it's kind of moved from the kind of the grand things perhaps to the very practical things that each of us can do.
Last point, you talked about the net zero standard. You don't have to give away the secret sauce, but what is your hope for this? Maybe next year you say it comes out. Is it going to be definitive of this is what net zero means? Because this is the big thing that everyone has struggled with. Is it emissions abated? Is it how much, whatever? So what's the standard briefly, if you can explain what your work?
I'm so excited about this because I think it is the first time that we will bring together various different ways of thinking about net zero and different frameworks into a single consolidated, this is what good looks like.
Right.
Which is great. And it will help all the way through the kind of the journey of net zero, which I think is also helpful in terms of giving lots of various different options. It can be used by any scale and size of organization, which is fantastic. And the critical thing is it's going to be something which can be verified. And the thing that will give it the scale is something that I mentioned at the beginning, which is it's not just a BSI standard. Obviously, it's an international standard. So globally, it's going to be rolled out. And globally, there will be organizations that can do that verification. So this is part of this kind of national quality infrastructure that we have in the UK, but every member of the WTO has the same infrastructure. So, and I think it could be the biggest standard ever. So I've got really, really high hopes. And I say that just on the back of how many people we've managed to convene to come together to work on that standard, because we've never seen in the world of international standards that kind of commitment before. And I think people are just very, very anxious that we take away some of the confusion and have something that really is kind of definitive that people can work on. The other great thing about a standard is it's constantly being refreshed. So, you know, we can work on that kind of over time. We can improve it and get it better over time. So I think it'll be something that every organization will really want to kind of take seriously. And we've had, as I said, the fact that we've had such extraordinary commitment and engagement to producing this piece of best practice, I think really makes me think that organizations are going to take this very, very seriously. And we've got some front runners already, organizations that were working the predecessor to the standard with some guidelines, the net zero guidelines, and organizations already starting to kind of use them. So I'm very, very excited about it.
Excellent. I can see it now. My net zero standard t-shirt sponsored by
It's coming. It's coming. There is a standard for everything, and especially around net zero.
There's a standard for anything. One for that. Exactly. Susan, it's been a pleasure, real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for that. And that's been really excellent stuff. What's the website if people want to have a look at what you're doing around net zero?
Well, you'll find it on the BSI group website. So
you got bsi.org or
group.com.
Right. Brilliant. Thank you for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've got my standards now. I know what to do.
You know what to do. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Sumit. Really appreciate you having me on.
It's been a great podcast. Tell us what you think, ladies and gents. Get in touch. You know the social media handles to use. You know the email if you want to feature on the podcast, and drop us a line, nethero@futurenetzero.com. My thanks to Zoe for the production this week. We'll catch you on the next episode.
You've just heard the Net Hero podcast from futurenetzero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. futurenetzero.com. Better business, better planet.